Seamus Heaney, uno dei più grandi poeti del mondo irlandese, premio Nobel per la letteratura nel
Nobel Prize laureate in literature in
1995, dell'American Academy.
Thank you for coming back to Italy. We are extremely honored to have you here again.
A Rai News 24 questa intervista. Lei è nato il 3 aprile del 1939.
You were born on April 3rd, 1939, in a farm in the Derry County, in Castle Dawson, the first of 9 children in Northern Ireland.
Nel 1944,
Seamus Heaney, in 1944, you were only 5 when the American troops entered Northern Ireland, an event that must be very far in your memory. History was in the making, and you were very young. This event is recalled in your poetry by a voice off, with the gaze that heals the wounds of a country deeply damaged by the horrors of the Second World War. Your poetry is a reconciliation attempt. Horrible historical events were about to unravel in that far 1944, such as the nuclear bombs dropped by the Americans on the Japanese towns of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, an unthinkable tragedy. How do you remember such a dramatic time of the world history?
The event was associated with the arrival of Americans because they were preparing to invade Europe, and British Army and the Americans were allies, obviously. Northern Ireland was part of the British war effort, not the Republic, but the North where we lived. So my first memory of that is as a child being up a tree, overlooking the local road, and I saw the column of troops coming along, and the jeeps and tanks and armoured cars passing underneath. And ever since then, I've thought that it was rather like the entry of evil into Eden, or the entry of modernity into the old world of rural Ireland. So that was where it happened. Then there was an aerodrome beside us, and the aeroplanes, there was training obviously for D-Day, as they called it, and the aeroplanes keep coming in. So that was my experience of the war. Airplanes in the air, soldiers on the ground. Excuse me. Yeah, soldiers on the ground, airplanes in the air, and a general sense of the war in the air, in the radio, but I had no idea really about what was happening, not the slightest. And I suppose part of my effort later on has been to remember and make sense of what I remember in a different way. Anahorish, 1944. We were killing pigs when the Americans arrived. A Tuesday morning, sunlight and gutter blood outside the slaughterhouse. From the main road they would have heard the squealing, then heard it stop, and had a view of us in our gloves and aprons coming down the hill. 2 lines of them, guns on their shoulders, marching. Armoured cars and tanks and open jeeps. Sunburnt hands and arms. Unknown, unnamed, hosting for Normandy. Not that we knew then where they were headed, standing there like youngsters as they tossed us gum and tubes of coloured sweets.
Seamus Heaney,
in those years you were a student at the Anahorish Elementary School. It is 1944 and it is Northern Ireland, something that comes back in your collection, District and Circle, translated into Italian by Luca Guarneri. In those poems you talk about that period of time, you, a child, who sees the Americans arriving in Northern Ireland. Why many years later do you talk about that event in your poem?
Well, the poem about the American troops in the book District and Circle, it was written after I saw television reports of the American troops on the roads of Afghanistan and of the farmers with their turbans and their robes sitting watching these strange American troops in going past, and you realize that this was the beginning of something very dangerous. So what came back to me was myself as a youngster watching the troops in the 1940s, 1943, 44, and my neighbours watching, they were pig farmers, and on Tuesday mornings they used to kill the pigs for pork. So you'd hear the squealing of these pigs in the slaughterhouse. So something in the poem, I hope that the squealing of the pigs and the danger of the troops come together in some kind of imaginative way.
Parliamo ora della sua prima raccolta di versi.
Let's talk about your first collection of poems, Death of a Naturalist, published in 1966 by Faber and Faber in London. You were 27 years old. Since then, Faber and Faber has always been your publisher. Your main poem, like a manifesto, is digging, like digging with the pen, and not with the spade and the gun of the Irish fighters, because the word is the weapon of the great conqueror. It's a blade plunged in the flesh. The pen digs, listen, but history flows under its own eyes.
Well, language in Ireland is basically solidified history, or it's history, first of all, it's history of a loss of language, of the native Irish language. Then it's the English language from the 17th century onwards. And not only English, but Scottish, when the Presbyterian colonists came to Northern Ireland in the 17th century also. So history and place names tell a story in Ireland of precisely what you say, of victory of a conquered people. Anna Horish, which I mentioned, is in the Irish language is Annach Ir Iske, the place of clear water. And I've written many poems about the names of places. And also archaeology is it's been one of my subjects really. In Ireland, the bogland preserves many things, and you could say that our museums, the museums which contain our heritage, contain most of the exhibits have been found in bogs. So our history is to do with digging down and finding out, digging down through the layers of time.
In the 70s, more specifically 1969, the conflict in Northern Ireland was about to start. Those were the years of the so-called low-intensity conflict, which took place between the end of the 60s and the end of the 90s in Northern Ireland, more specifically Belfast, and whose consequences were felt also in Great Britain and in the Republic of Ireland, in Dublin. The upheaval caused more than 3,000 casualties. It was an internal fight which lasted 30 years. In Ulster, Catholic citizens were victims of discrimination by the Protestant ruling majority. Finding a job was more difficult for them, and they were confined in council houses. Seamus Heaney, what do you remember of that period?
Well, I remember the mixture of excitement and perhaps menace, because the moment of the civil rights movement in Ireland was in the north of Ireland, looking for, end of discrimination in housing, one vote in local elections, several political demands, and that there were marches, there were student protests and so on. So there was a sense of the quickening of possibility, of life coming back to a very inert situation, of the second-class citizens on the move. So there was excitement. But then after the marches took place and the crackdown by the state police on the marchers, the mood darkened, and the two sets of people, the loyalist mobs, the Protestant mob, and the Republican Catholic crowds, they were in street fighting together. And the irony is that the British Army arrived to protect the Catholics, and because they were being assailed from all sides by the Protestant loyalist masses, and with the help of the police, actually, on occasions. So it started like that, and I could remember explosions, news of assassinations, people killed, people we knew. So all that can be remembered. But the main thing is that it eventually, after useless years of destruction, violence, killing, it eventually came to an end in 1994. And since then, structures have been set up which are an improvement, definitely, on the life that was lived in Ireland, in Northern Ireland. And there is a hope, not necessarily optimism, but hope at the moment.
Your family lived in a period of strong social tensions because it belonged to the Catholic minority in Ulster. Nevertheless, your poetic voice brought about a silent, subtle, yet powerful transformation by digging the language. Even if you have never overtly waged a protest against discriminations, you managed to find many followers in the region where you were born, in Northern Ireland, and in Great Britain too. Mr. Heaney, how can a person start digging the individual and collective psyche? How can one bring about transformation through poetry?
Well, I think in tight-bound communities, and that can be a whole country, if the artist tells his or her own secrets, he or she is telling the secrets of the whole community, the secret knowledge. And you have it usually in countries under oppression, like, say, Poland during the Soviet period, even Russia itself during the Soviet period. The artists, the poets, they were transmitting signals from individual to individual psyche. So I think that's the way it has to begin, from a first source. I think sometimes a poet writes a poem, one poem, perhaps his autobiography, then he gets readers, maybe a dozen readers, he has an audience, and then maybe he gets 100 readers. You have the beginnings of a culture. And that I think is fundamentally the way it happens, by stealth almost, you know. If we're talking about places in crisis, and that's where the poems we're talking about come from. Montali has a beautiful essay called "The Second Life of Art," and I think he gets it spot on. He talks about writing poetry, art, arising out of the shared life, being found in the form of literature, and then going back into the life it sprung out of, so that it is completed when it is received back. the audience is very important also.
Nel 1976
In 1976, you finally left Northern Ireland and Belfast, and you moved with your wife, first to Wicklow and then to Dublin, in the Republic of Ireland. Later, you became an Irish citizen to teach English literature at university. In 1984, you were appointed professor of rhetoric and oratory at Harvard University in the United States. Later, between 1989 and 1994, you were professor of poetry at the Oxford University. In Electric Light, translated into Italian by Luca Guarneri, you talk about the end of the conflict in Northern Ireland. A man has been eradicated from his small reign in Ulster. What are your memories of that eradication?
Well, I think it was the calling of poetry. I worked in Belfast, in the north of Ireland, where I grew up. I grew up in the countryside, but I was educated at the university in Belfast. I taught there in the university. I published 3 books while I was living there. And then I thought, I haven't really committed myself fully to writing. My books were very well received. I was called a poet, but I wasn't sure if I was a poet. So we rented a house in the Republic in the countryside, and we lived for 4 years there, out of contact with most people. And that was the time when I worked very hard and felt I was earning the name of poet. And after that, I went back to teaching, and as you say, I taught in Harvard and so on. That way I was able to spend 4 months of the year teaching and 8 months free to do my own work. So the progress from childhood in the countryside to young manhood in the city to full adulthood as a worker of writing came about quite organically, and I was grateful for the experience of moving around.
Nel 1995 lei è stato
Seamus
conferito il
Heaney,
Nobel per la
in
letteratura dall'Accademia
1995,
Reale di Svezia. La
you were
sua è
awarded
una
with the
voce che
Nobel
parla
Prize for
attraverso
Literature
i
by the
grandi
Royal
poeti
Academy of
classici
Sweden.
per denunciare
Your
eventi
voice,
drammatici
through the
e
great classic
politici
poets,
dei nostri tempi.
reports about the dramatic
District
political
and
events of
Circle,
our times.
quando il mondo ha
In
subito
District and
uno
Circle,
scossone l'11 settembre del 2001,
when the
lei
world
cerca una
was
risposta in
shaken by
un'ode
9/11,
di Orazio
you tried to
sull'incertezza
find an answer
della
in an
fortuna e
ode
si
by
rifà
Horace
al Carpe Diem,
about the
cogli
uncertainty of
l'attimo,
fortune,
perché tutto
about
può
seizing the
accadere
day.
in un attimo.
Well, I had known the Horace poem before the September attacks on the Twin Towers in New York. I had spoken to students in Harvard about it, about it being a poem of shock and surprise. In the poem, Horatio hears, or doesn't hear anything. He sees a clear blue sky. He's not expecting anything. And suddenly the thunder comes. And he is shaken by it. And in English, the Latin word tremens, for the shaking earth, relates to the word tremendous, in meaning an extraordinary, large, shocking event. So when the Twin Towers were attacked and the 9/11, as they say, occurred, this came to my mind. And I did I changed the poem to the extent that I took off the top stanza, the first stanza, and I added a stanza of my own, where again the world is shaken at the end. So it was indeed, as you say, a case of the older poet speaking through the modern poet, and it's one way, I think, in which the classics come to our aid. They allow us, we can use them almost like a megaphone to tell of our own distresses. Anything can happen. You know how Jupiter will mostly wait for clouds to gather head before he hurls the lightning? Well, just now he galloped his thunder cart and his horses across a clear blue sky. It shook the earth and the clogged under earth, the river Styx, the winding streams, the Atlantic shore itself. Anything can happen. The tallest towers be overturned, those in high places daunted, those overlooked, regarded. Stropped beak fortune swoops, making the air gasp, tearing the crest off one, setting it down bleeding on the next. Ground gives. The heavens wait, lifts up off Atlas like a kettle lid. Capstones shift. Nothing resettles right. Telluric ash and fire spores boil away.
La sua poesia,
even after you left Northern Ireland, your poetry fluctuated between sense and memory, present and past, but never forgetting the lessons of the classics. The Metamorphoses by Ovid, and in particular Book 10 and 11 that you translated. The passage where Ovid talks about Orpheus and Eurydice is one of the books that mainly influenced your poetry, with Dante, D'Annunzio, and Montale. Why Ovid? Maybe because he sings in a world of human unhappiness?
Well, I have to confess that most of my work in Latin has been with Virgil, who is a very different kind of poet. I was commissioned to translate the Ovid pieces, but of course it's one of the great myths of the world, and I in fact had written a poem called The Underground, which involved myself and my wife, which she managed to come up all right, but the underground and the myth of losing the woman in the dark, it's very powerful. Since I've been in Italy, especially this time in Rome, I've got much, much more interested in Ovid, because we have been at a conference in the American Academy on Ovid, and I've learned a lot and wakened up to him in a new way. But I think that, yeah, you're quite right, there's a lot of passion and driven, people destined to overdo it and to enter into danger unwittingly, but suddenly, and I think the metamorphoses are, they're like Shakespeare in English. They are a huge tapestry of story, fiction, possibility, you know, and we're grateful to have it.
Your poetry goes through history and war, through symbols or symbolic situations that have compassion for man. Like when you talk about the butcher who butchers the animal to show us what the events mean for the individuals. Your poetry seems personal, but it actually touches events and becomes a testimony of history. It is as if you were in exile in your own homeland. You are the son of Dante, but you participate to the fate of life, bringing with you the great tragic joy, like your master Yeats. What is the task of the poet?
Well, I can do no better than quote W.B. Yeats, who described the task in a phrase which I love, but it's an instruction which is impossible to follow, but it's a beautiful phrase. He said, I have tried to hold in a single thought reality and justice. It's a beautiful, beautiful phrase, but I don't know that anybody not even Yeats, can hold reality and justice in one single image or thought. I'm also devoted to something, the problem that was stated by the Polish poet Czesław Miłosz, whom I really have a high regard for, very high regard. And he says in one of his poems, "What is poetry that does not save nations or people?" He said it's a song of drunkards or whatever. That's one. When you're living in a situation like Northern Ireland where people are being killed and where there is violence, you can understand that desperate cry, what is poetry that does not save nations or people? On the other hand, Joseph Brodsky, whom I used to know, said something very different, completely opposite, which was also convincing. He said, if art teaches us anything, it is that the human condition is private. And I think between those two extremes, poetry has to find its way.
Lei ha scritto molti libri
You
di
wrote
poesia,
dozens of
ma mi
books
piace
of
qui
poems,
ricordare
but
uno
here
dei suoi
I'd like to
ultimi
remember
tradotto
one
in
of your
Italia.
last books,
In Catena
translated
Umana
into Italian
entra
in
in contatto
2010
con le
by
cose
Luca
ultime,
Guarneri,
gli ultimi
entitled
istanti della vita.
Human Chain.
Lo vediamo
In
nella
Human
sequenza
Chain, you
Chanson
deal with the last
d'avventure,
moments
in
of
cui il suo
life.
corpo
We
si
can see
avvicina
it
a
in the
quell'oltre,
sequence
nel
Chanson
quale non si era
d'Aventure,
mai
in
trovato,
which your
e
body lives a
vive
dramatic
un'esperienza
experience in the
drammatica,
hospital
un
on a
trasporto
stretch
in
for a
barella in
surgical
ospedale.
operation. And it gets
Il
close
limite
to the
dell'umano,
afterlife,
il
where
dover
it
prima
had
o
never
poi
been before.
raggiungere
It's
il
the
confine
human
della
limit. Are you
vita.
afraid of the moment
Cosa
when
che
you
mi fa
have to reach
paura.
the frontier of life?
I don't think I'm afraid of death anymore. When I was much younger, I thought about it much more in a different way. But I think that literature has helped, mythology has helped. I mean, of course, like every other Catholic child, I was filled with the underground of hell and the upward sky of heaven. So I had a kind of vertical structure. And even though hell was the most preoccupying of the destinations when I was a youngster, but that goes, and it's substituted in my case with Book 6 of the Aeneid or Book 11 of the Odyssey or Dante, that these are journeys, and that there is a furtherance. That's about all I could say about the afterlife, that it is beautifully imagined by poets of all ages and by myths of all ages. And I think they assist the sense of ongoingness that might deserve the phrase eternal life, I don't know. Love's mysteries in souls do grow, and yet the body is his book. Strapped on, wheeled out, fork lifted, locked in position for the drive, bone shaken, bumped at speed. The nurse a passenger in front, you ensconced in her vacated corner seat, me flat on my back. Our postures all the journey still the same, everything and nothing spoken. Our eye-beams threaded later fast. No transport ever like it until then, in the sunlit cold of a Sunday morning ambulance, when we might, oh my love, have quoted Donne on love on hold, body and soul apart.
Leggendo Catena Umana, ci si rende
Reading
conto
Human
ancora
Chain,
una volta
one
di
can
quanto
realize
sia
once
difficile
again how
distinguere e
difficult it
separare
is to
Seamus
distinguish
Heaney,
between
il poeta,
Seamus
dal
Heaney, the
lettore di
poet,
poesia. Lo
and the reader
dimostrano
of
la
poetry,
sua
as in your
reinterpretazione
reinterpretation of
di
L'Aquilone
che chiude
by
il
Giovanni
volume,
Pascoli,
e i versi
which
di
closes the
Linea
volumes,
110,
and the
che
verses of
raccontano un
Linea
viaggio in autobus con
110,
in tasca
telling
il
of a
libro
trip on a
sesto
bus
dell'Eneide di
with the
Virgilio.
fourth book of the
Lì fui,
Aeneid by
io
Virgil
nel
in your
luogo,
pocket.
e il
Lì
luogo
fui,
in
io
me.
nel luogo e il luogo in
luogo di
me.
cui lei
You
ci
talk about a
parla,
place where
il
one
luogo
can
in cui si
find
trova
poetry.
la
This is the
poesia,
tradition of the
è
great
la
fathers of
tradizione.